Hello and welcome to the newest season of the Shindig, an archaeology podcast brought to you by Rubicon Archaeology Group. And this is a new season, so hey, we thought we'd surprise you with a new host. To my left, we have Gretchen Kessler. Gretchen, thanks for being our new host.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
What makes you think that you're good enough to do this? Tell us about you.
My name's Gretchen. I'm an archaeologist. I come from a background in media. I used to work in the film industry, and then just a couple of years ago, I retrained for archaeology here in Ireland. So I'm excited to share my knowledge and my love of archaeology with the greater world.
It's the knowledge that we have you here for, because I don't know anything about archaeology. I know editing and big fingers press buttons. That's all I know. So
that's why you brought me on.
Gretchen's here to be the genius of the group and interview people from the world of archaeology. We have a good season.
We do, yeah. We have a lot of really interesting topics coming up.
Do you want to tell the people about today's episode?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be delighted to talk about it. So today we're going to be talking about conflict archaeology. And conflict archaeology is something that I hadn't really considered before I talked to today's guests. Mm-hmm. I knew there would be warfare, but I had no idea that there was such societal ramifications around the world of conflict. So
I think what's interesting with this episode is we have two people in it. One who is a reenactment specialist.
Yeah, two very different backgrounds.
Yeah, and we have Damian Shiels, who is
very academic.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you have on one hand, you have the person who actually lives the experience. And on the other hand, you have the person who studies the archaeology and what we can learn from going around like old battlefields and encampments and what would it have been like to be living at that time in that scenario. Yeah,
so I think that there's nothing else to do except take you straight in for this interview with Alex Lee and Damian Shiels.
Yeah.
Conflict archaeology.
Let's get into it. Good morning to you both, and thank you so much for being on the Shindig. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about conflict archaeology. This is actually a subject that I didn't know very much about before I researched for this show, so I hope that listeners will find it really interesting. To begin with, could you give me just a brief background on your work on the subject and how you got here, what time periods you guys work in? That'd be great.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I've been involved in historical reenactments for just over 20 years, and I was always the early medieval period and American Civil War are two periods I was really fascinated about. So I be trying to get as accurate as I can to the time period, especially by using research online, everything that we can do between historical and archaeological records. That led me to starting doing experimental archaeology in UCD, and then became an archaeologist, and now that's where I kind of got here today. So I travel across Europe doing a lot to Denmark, Iceland, Germany, on the way to Poland hopefully this year, but I do a lot of educational shows and talks where we immerse ourselves in experimental archaeology for a week as they would have lived at the time period, so we could better understand. And we do a lot of trials, experiments, projects that a lot of them are trial and error, but a lot of them are based off archaeological finds, so we get a better understanding and more immersive feel of what it was like back in the day.
Well, I share Alex's passion for the American Civil War, but shin scale ella, as they say. For me, from a conflict archaeology perspective, I started, I suppose, more or less quite soon after I came out of university, which is a depressingly long time ago. About 25 years ago, when conflict archaeology was in its very early phases, and we ran projects looking for the sites, myself and a colleague, Paul O'Keefe, who's now with the TII, looking for the Kinsale, 1601 siege sites in relation to Kinsale. And it kind of grew out of that, looking at lots of different conflict-related sites. Early on in my career, we excavated a mass grave in Carrickmines in County Dublin relating to the 17th century as well, which we wrote up afterwards. And then kind of it's been a series of examining different periods. I would have started looking at 16th, 17th century in particular, but with Rubicon, we did a massive project for the state called the Irish Battlefields Project, which was an attempt with our partners Enniclan, who did the history, to try and locate and map every battlefield in the Republic of Ireland between the 8th and the 18th century. So this kind of massive expanse of time. So there've been lots of kind of different aspects of it, I suppose, I've been involved in over the years. We got to do, again, Rubicon, metal detection survey to Vinegar Hill battlefield in 1798, for example. And then, you know, things like looking later periods, so revolutionary, archaeology, which I was just talking about last night, actually, looking at the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence and the Civil War. So it kind of stretches the full gamut, if you like, mainly through the historic periods.
Fascinating. So let's start with the basics. How do we define conflict archaeology? Damian, I'll start with you. First day of class, what are you putting on the whiteboard?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad term, I suppose, to kind of go back into the history of it a bit. It kind of started as straight up battlefield archaeology. You know, it grew out of the United States. A guy called Doug Scott, looking at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand, kind of famously in the early 1980s, and kind of metal detection survey looking specifically at battlefields. But as it grew as a discipline in the late 90s and 2000s into where it is today, where it's kind of pretty big, it's broadened out an awful lot to not just look at kind of classic battlefield archaeology, but all elements of conflict in its kind of broad terms. And that can include everything, you know, to memorialization of conflict and things like interpersonal conflict in prehistory, you know, not necessarily battles. So it's quite a broad church these days in terms of its kind of breadth and anything where you can kind of imagine conflict happening. So a good example, for example, in contemporary times might be things like the infrastructure on the border in Ulster relating to the Northern Ireland conflict. You know, so it goes to the full gamut of that and how societies react to it using kind of archaeological approaches. You know, what's the physical record behind, what's the material culture record that we can see, be it through human remains or remains in the ground or upstanding buildings that relate to conflict or tension within society. So it's grown into a very kind of rich discipline, I think, from its pure battlefield beginnings, which is still an important part of it, of course.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into it. So how do we recognize conflict in the archaeological record? What is it that we find that tells us there was conflict or there was a battle fought here or a skirmish or some sort of violence going on?
Well, I suppose one thing that stood out for me really, I suppose you have the mass graves are a big one. But the historical record, for me, the earliest I know of really got me interested was the Battle of Visby, where you had a mass grave, and that was, I think it was 2,300 bodies were found, and they were all wearing armour, and that kind of piqued me. But then you have the historical record of the time then as well. So everything that was being recorded compared to the early medieval period, things aren't being recorded as they would have been. So everything started being written down in the medieval period. So by the time we get to the 14th century, they're recording battles, they're recording almost their own sagas of the king's invasions and the king's stories and whatnot. So when they come into 1361, you have the King Attenberg. We knew he had a Danes and German mercenaries. He wanted the island of Gotland, so he invaded. And he just had a professional army, and he knew that he was up against peasants and farmers. So he knew that his side recorded, obviously, more victories. But until it was 1905, then when they found the mass graves, I think in total there was 5 mass graves. So they were able to find there was a big battle. And I think a lot of those were recorded on battlefield sites. So I think yourself, you probably know better about finding these battlefield sites, I think, Damien.
Yeah, well, I mean, in an Irish context, it's actually it's surprising sometimes how challenging it can be. So to kind of go on the battlefield front, I suppose there was an excavation that occurred in England called on the Towton battlefield, actually, where they found a mass grave, like what Alex was talking about as well. And they did there were surveys done. There had been metal detection that had been taking place there, and they found a load. This is a War of the Roses battle. They found a load of arrows and things, that were fired by longbowmen and stuff. And there was a big hope. Oh, we can go and we can find loads of medieval battlefields now. And that kind of has not been as possible as we initially hoped. There's been kind of efforts to find Hastings, Agincourt, famous battlefields, but there has to be very specific ground conditions for a lot of that kind of older metalwork to survive in the ground. So it's much easier to find battlefields now after the age of weapons, of firearms comes in, because of lead bullets. Lead bullets are preserved. So if you have any of our kind of standard 16th, 17th century battlefields in Ireland, like, have enormous potential, and particularly so because metal detection requires an archaeological license in Ireland, so we don't have as much illicit detection as they do in England. So that creates a big potential for that. But in terms of the upstanding remains, though, it can be anything. Like in our work in Kinsale, the English created gigantic siege fortifications there, one of which, the largest, was bigger than the walled city of Derry at the time. And you can try and find traces of those sort of fortifications. Again, to refer to some of the work we did, the Landscapes Revolution and Rubicon together in, say, East Cork and in other places, you can look at even houses around, around where our head office is. And you can look at safe houses that were being used by the IRA. Seemingly ordinary houses, but these are being used as part of a kind of a guerrilla warfare campaign in that period. So it can almost be anything and everything once it relates to something like that. So it's a very different time period dependent. A friend of mine, Dr. Linda Fibiger in Edinburgh, for example, the way she approached it was she started to look at human remains from the Neolithic. And one of the things she was finding, was there was a few years ago, kind of an idea that everybody was kind of dancing around, hugging each other in until the Bronze Age, when this warrior culture comes in. She was finding that there was a very high rate of interpersonal trauma in the Neolithic, a lot of kind of evidence for slings and stuff being hit, people being hit. So there's this whole, again, I suppose to go back to this massive range of potential, and with these different techniques that you can use to try and get at it in different periods.
Agreed. And I suppose a lot of it as well would be written on the bones. You would see, serious trauma on the bones.
Very much so. Just to give you the example, the mass grave we excavated at Carrick Mines was from 1642 when the castle fell, and we had historical records of it. They weren't massively detailed. They broke into the castle and they killed man, woman, and child. And we found the mass grave there actually in a topsoil level. It was right under the sod, incredible preservation. But the analysis, Linda did that analysis as well, actually, of the remains we found there, were able to show that they had died in a massacre event. Apart from the way the bodies are laid out, not east-west or whatever, they're kind of thrown into the pit. But, there was different types of trauma. There was sharp force trauma that suggested that people were on the ground or on their knees, putting their arms in the air, being sliced at. Other people in it had been shot, and others had blunt force trauma, like something like, the reverse end of a firearm being clubbed. And what that tells you, when you have one pit with all this type of kind of evidence in it on the bones, is that these people were killed in hot blood, quote unquote, not cold blood. It's a kind of a chaotic event. There's no planning, to their execution. They're all being killed in a variety of ways in close proximity. So you can actually tell an awful lot about these moments of time. I've referred to it before, like it preserves these moments of traumatic time, whether it's on the human bone or, through what you find in whether it's bullets on a battlefield or whatever it may be.
Sweet.
So was that totem as well, wasn't it?
Oh, sorry, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, it's how you grasp there. Yeah, no, sorry, I was saying a ballad totem, wasn't it? The 37 skeletons that were found in the first one, all had head trauma, blunt force trauma, and some trauma to the back of the head, which suggested execution.
Yeah. Alex, I know with your work in experimental archaeology that you actually worked making medieval weapons. Could you talk a bit about what that process was like and what it was like going from making the weapons to actually wielding them on the field?
Yeah, so usually what we do is we look at, again, archaeological finds, and we get everything to the period that we can do, and we look at through metallurgy and metal analysis to see what they would have been constructed compared to iron and steel and stuff. So I've recreated spearheads before and stuff that we done early medieval, early Irish style. So we have nice small broad heads that we use. We think they're overused as one-handed spears more than two-handed spears and whatnot. So we would made it. We had a forge, we done it up, we got it going. We made our charcoal previously before that. Once we got a nice temperature on, we got it going. We had our anvil. So it actually took me about 5 or 6 attempts to actually make the spearhead, because my first go was awful. But it was great once it was done. It was nicely balanced. I think it worked out at being about 620 grams for the spearhead itself. So then when you have your ash shaft, we use traditional tools. So we just got our spruce, left it dry out for a whole year. That was nice then. So we had ash, we cut it down, we quartered our planks, and we shaved everything down into a spearhead and spear shaft. Then we shafted a spear, and using that, then we look at against all body finds that we were looking at between grave finds and damages done. So a lot of those were legs, hands, head. A lot of the torso wasn't really affected by it. So then we try to understand how would we use these weapons At the moment, for us as experimental archaeologists, I say, but more even as medieval sword fighters and weapon experts, we don't think they would have thrown those spears as often as we think we do. At the moment, we're kind of studying to see they use them one-handed as a long shaft. So as we fight, I've done battles with 800 people where we hold the end of the spear and the shaft goes up to the very tip, and use that as a stabbing weapon and slashing if you want to. With the bigger spears, you don't have the same control. So from start to finish, it wasn't that long of a process, but it was hard. It was just a learning curve. But using the weapons end to understand was more enjoyable to me. Learning the body mechanics, how your body would have to hold, how you stand. So again, looking at the finds, how they would have been standing in the battle line. I think in Uppsala, there was one guy whose right shin was just nearly decimated with slashes, scars, healed wounds, old wounds, new wounds. So we knew there stood right leg predominantly forward. So then we tried to adapt that with our shields and spears. So a lot of body mechanics goes behind it when we're trying to understand how they would have fought. And we're looking at the weapons as well, the damage done to the blades, done to the spearheads, what would have inflicted that, how would have blocked it, how would it have attacked, what angles they were using to cause that to form on the weapon as well.
And using the specific weapons, thinking like broadswords and archers, you can see a difference in the skeletons of the bodies of people who wielded those weapons. Can you talk a bit about that?
You could do. Actually, I started reenacting 20 years ago, and I got a full checkup just before Christmas, and I've overdeveloped the muscles on the left side of my body from doing this for so long, and it's my shield arm. So then my right arm, I have all my fingers after being fractured and broken, and overdeveloped my intercostals on the right side from those weapons. So, and my shins are actually destroyed. So I have all these hairline fractures all down my shins. So I'd love for an osteo to pick up my skeleton sometime.
You'd be confusing archaeologists in the future.
I think so, yeah. But it's interesting to see. It's a lot of guys I know are broad chested, and these people have been doing it for so long. I have a friend who's an archer that I think he fired a 140-pound warbow, and he's very barrel chested, and he's a lot of strain in his body. But as we get older, these wounds do come in to slow us down. Even now, after 20 years, I'm like waking up in the morning aching. But this was how they used the weapon. So I can imagine back then, they were obviously a lot fitter, but they were training probably as long as I was really when I started. So I imagine they had some sort of damage to their body and muscular problems and issues from using those weapons, because there is a lot of heavy trauma really when you're swinging a weapon around like that constantly. It's going to take a toll on your body and your muscles.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to talk a bit now about locating battlefields. I think that some people might be surprised to hear that it's actually quite difficult sometimes to find where battlefields are, whether it's because contemporary sources mention landmarks that don't exist anymore, or they assume that the reader has a pre-existing knowledge of the battle. Could you talk a bit about what sources you have to use to actually locate where famous battles were fought?
Yeah, well, if we look at Ireland, it's actually quite challenging. So we've again, if we go back, we can go back to the early medieval period, for example. And we've looked, as I say, everything kind of from that Viking period forward. It's very difficult with the sources that we have for the early period, particularly the Irish sources, to locate battles, right? So because the Irish sources, these guys aren't writing stuff down with the idea, we'll make sure that archaeologists in the future can pinpoint exactly where this occurred. The Irish sources are fantastic, but a lot of what they're concerned with is things like, family lineage and who was there and who died and things like that. So they often don't provide an awful lot of detailed locationary evidence. As we move through time, with particularly the English colonial sources, because often they're reporting to their masters, a lot of what we have left even from the medieval period, but very much so when you get into kind of the 16th, 17th century, they're kind of reports. And so there's a lot more specificity about what they're saying in terms of where they were and what they were doing. And so that kind of comes into it. So as a result of that, like the earliest battle that we can be sure that we know where it is located is from the Anglo-Norman invasion at Bag-and-Bun in County Wexford, because there's a very defined location there where that occurred. It's very difficult after that. But by the time by the time you get into the 16th century, you can start to locate an awful lot more of these. In the 17th century, we know where an awful lot of them are. And so, you know, if you're looking, when you're starting out, you have to look at all these sources and then try and use these location indicators. You know, we crossed 2 streams and then we came up against a boggy area of ground or whatever it may be, and then try and locate it on the landscape. You have to take into consideration the significant land alterations in Ireland. A lot of Irish battles, for example, are fought in things like they call passes, which in our mind's eye, we immediately think of like big mountains and stuff like this. But in an Irish context, that's often a pass through a bog. And, you know, drainage might have eradicated a lot of that landscapes after that. But once you've done that sort of analysis, it's then going onto the ground. So you're looking at an awful lot of aerial imagery, old mapping and things like that. In an Irish context, we're quite fortunate in that a lot of our field boundaries and things, many of them would have been present. So, for example, in 1798 in the Battle of Vinegar Hill, we were able to show that the field boundaries that still exist in and around that hill are absolutely intrinsic to what occurs on that battlefield because they're being used as defensive positions. It was the same at the bloodiest battle in Irish history at Aughrim in County Galway from the Williamite Wars. And again, when you then start to try and ground truth stuff, really, as I was mentioning, it is, you know, if they were firing lead bullets at your friend. When we started out at Kinsale, none of the archaeological sites of those English siege sites had any archaeological protection. They weren't recorded, you know, formally on our record, and we didn't have any money. So what we did to try and prove the locations of the camps is a metal detection survey to look for the lead bullets. And so that has to be very systematic, and it is a highly skilled, people don't realize this, but metal detection is a highly skilled scientific method. It is just devastating to conflict sites if somebody walks out into a field with a metal detector and pulls up a whole load of bullets and then goes, well, I found them in that field. To be quite frank about it, they're nearly as good. They've lost nearly all their scientific value if you do that. You have to, as we did at Vinegar Hill, and we have a blog actually on the Rubicon site about some of this, but it has to be a very systematic survey with people doing linear transects at a known rate with a known level of recovery, GPS locating each find. And when you do that at Vinegar Hill, just to give you an example of what this can tell you, the Vinegar Hill site outside Enniscorthy has a little laneway that leads up to the top of the hill now where people drive up to kind of look at the memorial and everything. And that laneway is a bit of an annoyance if you're driving a coach up there, right? Because you can just fit a coach up. And a few years ago, there was some talk, maybe we should widen that road, you know, to make it easier for people to get up there. When we did our survey there, the fines on one side of that lane were so intense that we were able to actually show where the government, some of them were Irish, so I won't say British, but the British government troops, as they advance up the hill, you can follow their line of advance because there are guys fumbling bullets as they come into battle and they're dropping them. There are people firing them into the side of the hill. We even have artillery rounds where they're firing anti-personnel munitions against people. But you look at that line and you go across the laneway and there's virtually no material. And the reason is because in that battle, we can tell from the finds that were left there, the British troops, the government troops, used that laneway, which was in existence, and the line of that to orientate their line as they marched up the hill. And so, you know, you're proving that a standing archaeological monument, if you like, which is the hedges and field boundaries, which I don't think get enough love in a general archaeological sense, particularly in Ireland where they're so important, is an intrinsic element. But you're able to show that because of the systematic detection of it. And so like that they're kind of a lot of the approaches. Some of the things that are quite difficult, people can be surprised at how difficult it can be to locate, are things like mass graves on battlefields. Very few of them have ever been located where archaeologists have set out to find them, if that makes sense. Most of them that have been recovered have been accidental, even in places like Towton and places. They were accidental discoveries. The only really good example, the best example, is from a battlefield called Lutzen from the 30 Years War in Germany. It's, for anyone into their Nordics, it's where Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish king, was killed. But an archaeologist called Andres Sugar spent years doing a huge survey, metal detection survey of the entire battlefield, so that they could actually place where everything was, and there was a small little blank spot, and they went, that's where there's a mass grave. And sure enough, that's where it was. But it's quite remarkable, actually, how small these can be and how many people you can fit in a very small space on these battlefields. So that's still one of the tricky elements of it. And in an Irish context, I'll say this. Vinegar Hill is the largest survey that's ever been done, and effectively we spent 2 weeks with a team of about 6 people. So, you know, there's been no massive research projects, which Ireland really is a very rich location for the potential to do that, and I'd love to see a bit more of it. If anybody with millions is listening.
Yeah, sponsor the thing, please.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So when we find artifacts that signify conflict in a location, I'm curious, are you able to differentiate between a battlefield and, say, a military camp where people are getting ready to go to battle? Are there clues that tell you one is where a battle actually fought versus where one is where people were getting ready for the battle?
So normally you can, right? I'll give you a good example of this. But so for, again, if you go back to, say, looking at from kind of the age of firearms, Vinegar Hill is a good example of this. A lot of lead bullets will show if they've been fired, right, when they're found in the ground. So if now you'll always find some out and about, people hunted and stuff, right? So, but if you're beginning to find concentrations of them, important to note that not all bullets immediately are apparently fired. You know, they aren't all splattered against stuff, but you can find, if you know what to look for, traces of firing. You also come across stuff like at Vinegar Hill, we had things like the trigger guards of muskets, the evidence of hand-to-hand fighting where people were holding them up and they were being broken. That's something that they found, for example, at Culloden. Tony Pollard's work there on the site. They found where the Jacobites smashed into the Hanoverian line there because of these broken implements that suggest hand-to-hand fighting. But there's a good example of this that comes from, again, one of our own sites, and it's from Aughrim. When the M6 motorway was going through, it was clipping a very small peripheral area of the battlefield at a place called Luttrell's Pass. And they carried out a metal detection survey in advance of the road there. But again, this shows you where it's moved even in the last few years. This is about 15 years ago. Maybe it's 20 years ago, depressingly. Anyway, but they wanted to show that if they found material, they wanted to go, well, how do we know if we find stuff here that it isn't just people out hunting or stuff that they've dropped in a camp or whatever? And so they did a test field. They just picked another field on the scheme and they metal detected that as well to kind of show the material that came up. And I was fortunate enough to analyse the material that they found in Luttrell's Pass, and they didn't get an awful lot of material, right? It was about a dozen objects that you could say potentially relate to the battlefield. But the degree, because we know where it came from and the historical context of where it came from, and then analyse the material, you could tell an awful lot. So, for example, one of the objects was a fragmented hand grenade, the kind of classic Tom and Jerry hand grenade, you know, the round one with the kind of flaming fuse. But it was broken. It had exploded. There was a handful of different types of bullets, one of which, a number of them fired, one of which had been hammered from a round ball into a projectile called a slug, which was done by a specific troop type to try and make it a heavier impact bullet so that it would tumble when it was fired. There were also things like Jacobite gun money, right, around the place. Anyway, the swings and the roundabouts of the analysis was able to show that this was the Jacobites fleeing the battlefield, being ridden down by Williamites at the end of the day, and probably that the field was strewn, you know, here and there with bodies of people being ridden down, with a grenadier who you wouldn't be expecting to throw a grenade in that sort of scenario is trying to save his life by throwing a grenade at people following him. So it's that kind of impact that you can tell on things that you can recover. But similarly at Kinsale, like the bullets, although maybe one or two of them might have been fired, but at Kinsale, the bullets we were finding were indicative of them producing bullets within their camp. And actually in that case, there was deformities on the bullets that we think were caused by the severe weather conditions that the English troops were experiencing. Around about 6,000 English troops died of the weather at the siege of Kinsale. It was horrific. But we think that the actual weather conditions that they were experiencing in the siege are preserved within those bullets because of the deformities when they're trying to create these bullets over their campfire. So, and this analysis is moving on all the time. There's, PhDs are being done now, and the work of people like Alex doing experimental archaeology on things is teaching us more and more and more about how to differentiate not only between different weapons and things, but the kind of context in which they're being used and what they hit and all that sort of stuff.
Alex, you touched in your introduction about the research that you do when you bring a battle to life. Could you talk about that in some more detail?
Yeah, of course. So some of the bigger battles we do, there's proper committees set up in organizations, and these are made between the picks of historians, archaeologists, local communities, and we try to find as close as we can to what have partake in the battle. Now, some of it could be down to some entertainment and just keep people enjoyed, but what we try to do is, especially in the later medieval period, as you were saying as well, even the Battle of Kinsale, which we're hoping to eventually, is by looking what went on in the battle, who was set up where, and we're looking to look at the roles of each unit within the battle, so then we can recreate what they would have moved like, how many units would have had. For one of the big ones we do is Battle of Mosgard. It's a freestyle battle, and that's just for us to learn how we could use those troops on the line, how the mentality would have been used, and what a battle would have been like. So I think the biggest, was close 842, I think, people. It was one of the big anniversary battles for us. So it's a freestyle battle, and to come up, we train for the week. On a Friday, we have your commanders meetings, and we're discussing which units goes where, which will do what. We're trying to predict what the enemy would have been doing, how they would be using their units, knowing what troops they would use. And I imagine back in the day, it'd be very similar to those days of the battle, when thinking's like, right, we know that these guys have these units fighting from the German mercenaries. They could have French units, Prussians, whatever, like Battle of Waterloo, and we've massive scales of different units. So we're like, right, we know these guys are good at this. They can hold the centre. They're good on the flanks. We have cavalry behind them to use, which are well known from previous battles. So we can think that with the guys we're fighting. So when we break that down, then we go to the battlefield and hope for the best. And we beat, that battle, I think, was torrential rain then as well, which is hard to predict, which I imagine are the same as the battlefield. So we couldn't see what we were doing at one point, and we're fighting in a foot of mud, and you're about 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder. And when we do fight, we use steel weapons. They are blunt, but they do hurt, so we have to be careful slipping around the place. And then, of course, the thunder and lightning came right above us, which made it even more terrified. But it was a great, as we'd say, seeing the elephant, or the white elephant as I call it, like the closest experience you get to having a real battle. What would it feel like? Everyone got immersed into it. It was cold, wet, damp. Things were scary. You couldn't hear the commands being shouted out. So that was great for the public to see, because it was as real as it could have been for us if it was a real battle. But doing the research then as well, the UK do massive ones like the Battle of Tewkesbury, Battle of Toten. They do amazing job over representing what it would have been like, again, through historical records and the research these do. And a lot of them are local communities and groups and research groups and historical groups that would come together to do this. Evesham is another really big one, just before the battle for the Magna Carta, 13th century, and it's very impressive to see. These people could have up to 1,000 people fighting, and they tell the story as it goes, which is educating the public then to see what would have went on the battle, and they can see the left flank move forward and right flank move forward, and they got pushed back by the enemy while the centre flank held. And so educating the people around them what took part in the battle. So instead of watching a documentary, we could talk all day about the historical side of it and what went on, but it's good for the public to see hands-on what would have happened as it's been narrated to them, so they get entertainment and they can see. But there's a lot of work goes into it. We're planning for a big one now in August, and we've been planning that since last August, I'd say. So it's nearly years planning and work goes into it, between logistics and getting everyone involved, making sure everything is right, and a few rehearsals maybe along the time for some of the bigger roles that would present the kings and whatnot. So there's a lot of work does go into it, but it can be worth it in the end, either for entertainment value or for ourselves, just to get a better understanding of the battle mindset, I suppose, in one way.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for actually seeing it happen, either as a spectator or as a participant. And this is a little bit more philosophical, but when we think of conflict 100 years ago versus 500 years ago, what would you say transcends time? What are the commonalities of war across the centuries?
I suppose you're also going to have that fear, aren't you, about going to war, whether it's 100 years ago from World War One. And to imagine, especially in World War One, is going to be a terrifying time. People in the trenches first seeing machinery being used in the battlefield. Imagine first seeing tanks. You have your flamethrowers, you have gas. Compared to 500 years ago, where it was more gruesome as well, though, hand in hand. So it's like every war has different level of fear and different, I suppose, different things that people were worried about at the time. But everyone said, people will be talking about, oh, they were tough back then. It's like, you could be, soldiers today are tough, but they're still afraid to go to war. Like, no one wants to go to war. And I imagine that's going to be one continuous thing that that doesn't change, really. It's just that fear of going to war, fighting for your life, really, one way.
Yeah, the human aspect of it certainly is the thing that kind of transcends it all, as kind of these major traumatic events, like, you know, and it's just to go back to that mass grave at Carrick Mines, like, you can treat these things as abstract sometimes. We found a woman there who had, almost certainly with the remains that were there, normally they strip the dead after these engagements, but they don't appear to have done so here in that. We think because they had made such a mess of the people that they weren't useful, what they had on them. But one of the things that we found there is what we think was coins that a woman had sewn into her clothes to hide them, in the hope that when she got out of the siege, you know, she would have some sort of, and she never made it. It doesn't go. And there was a concealed key as well to a lockbox. You know, there weren't people who had keys and locks in the 17th century had something that they were trying to keep safe, and they had the key with them and stuff. And I always found that very affecting about the Carrick Mines material. Like, you have these kind of hopes of the victims for a future that doesn't occur. And that's something, you know, I suppose where we see more upfront with people's accounts from things like, say, the First World War, the Second World War, with that sort of stuff. But the kind of broad scale impact it has is enormous. And you even see that through, you know, going back through time, things like hoards. You know, so they found a coin hoard from the Williamite period as well. Somebody conceals the hoards in a time of conflict in the hope that presumably they're going to be able to retrieve it. And then what happens? They never retrieve it. So, you know, it's all that sort of stuff. Archaeology gets you at that. It gets you to that level of kind of individual experience further back in time that the sources don't really give us. We have them for a lot of later conflicts, and archaeology can play a big role in them too. But, you know, whereas we can read what Wilfred Owen was thinking, you know, on the Western Front, it's archaeology that allows us to really touch that for earlier periods.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'd like to talk about the dead now, those who fall in battle. And I'm interested, you're potentially hundreds or thousands of miles away from home. What was the importance of treating the dead? This is, when we look in the past, religion was a big part of people's lives. And I just wonder what sort of honors were afforded the dead when you're out on campaign. I know we talked about finding mass graves. Are they just thrown in a pit? Do we see any sort of reverence afforded to them? If we could talk a bit about that, that'd be really interesting.
Well, the medieval period, I suppose, if you're a common human or peasant, you're not getting much burial rights in these battles or even on crusades. So it's really something that's really afforded to the nobility or any lords who could have been afforded to it, who could have paid for it. But like on crusades is a long, long time to come back from. So a common example is Richard Lionheart. When he died in France on his way back, he was boiled his skin. I can't remember if it was in water or wine, but they boiled it just so they can remain the bones. And he was buried in 3 different places. And his body was buried in an abbey. His entrails were some other city in France, and then his heart was sent somewhere else. I can't remember the name of it. If it's Rouen. Rouen in France. But that was being a king. But you have other examples then of lords being bones boiled down, transported, or else buried. They could be buried, and as the meat is decomposed, they're decomposing and whatnot. And I think medieval period, if you're a normal person, you didn't really get many rights as a burial. I think they might have paid local people after the battle to be buried in mass graves, or just imagine there's a lot more out there we couldn't do. If might be lucky if your friend was alive, maybe he might have buried you and give you a Christian burial if they were lucky. But I think it was only the Lords really being transported back would have given that, had that right and privilege to be brought home.
Yeah, I think people maybe, even because we have in our mind's eye this kind of idea of the reverence that it's afforded the dead in even the relatively recent past. Battlefields and stuff are a kind of a different animal, even for guys burying their own side. You see that again in an Irish context. It's very much like Alex was saying, like the ordinary, even if they're your own people, there's kind of almost a set of rules as to how people are buried. It's convenient, like on a battlefield, even if you're the winning side, it tends to be close to a routeway. They tend to try and use some area that was open previously, that's easy enough, like it's efficiency, and you might get a small bit more respect than the enemy, but it's not enormous. Like Aughrim, there were poems written about for years after about the bones bleaching on the Aughrim battlefield, and these are Jacobite Irish. I mean, they're Irish on both sides, but Jacobite, like the local populace, the degree to which they're coming back, and the realities of life, it just doesn't afford it. It does develop through time, obviously, to kind of the current, where the Americans have a special team that they still send out to, Vietnam and stuff, looking for their dead or whatever. But in the kind of great scheme of things, it's only a relatively recent development where you'd even be able to identify people on your own side, that they would take the care to do that, where people would be named and things like that. So yeah, it's efficiency and simplicity tended to drive the way the dead of all sides were disposed of for much of history.
I'd like to talk about the in-between moments of battle. So, Alex, this is touching a bit on the work that you did, analyzing the Irish soldiers in America. And so you're on campaign, you're far away from civilization and its comforts, and but you have mundane problems that you experience along the road, whether it's your clothes tearing and needing to be fixed, or having to forage for food. And I wonder if you could just talk about what those sort of in-between moments would be and how soldiers dealt with them.
Yeah, so my end of year project really when I finished up in college was focusing on soldier cooking compared to camp cooking and soldiers cooking, and the ingenuity they had of making food and making life easier for themselves. So I primarily looked at the late war, where things were a bit more difficult for getting rations through, especially on the southern side, and was just by focusing and looking on letters. And I was actually lucky that some guy reached out from the Mississippi Department of Archives, and he was able to give me a load of letters of people writing home to their families, talking about the dinner they had, which was, I was lucky to find one fish between two units. There was our 8 men, and that was split up between them. And yeah, so when I done experimental archaeology, I recorded I made salted pork, which I actually kept under my stairs for 6 months before I went to cook it, and I tell you, it was not a nice experience. So I done that with a hardtack, and I done different methods cooking. So I tested in the early war from the field manual, just recreate a recipe off that. It wasn't too bad using the molasses and whatnot. Compared to the late war, where one person was described there had coffee, which is made from tree bark, old pouches of tobacco, and water from the river, and that's what used as coffee to sustain them. So I think it was more to bring cheer them up, maybe give them some feel of home under late in war and trying to forage, but things are very difficult for them. So they also had a lot of camp equipment at the start on the campaign. So when you look at the canteen halves, where if they're broken, they would chop them in half and we use them as frying pan. There's one find from the Gettysburg which I loved and recreated, which was I broke my bayonet, so I soldered that onto a broken belt buckle, which I used to ground up the coffee beans, which I used in coffee, which was kept in your haversack, which was a nice, easy invention that they came up with. But you look at all the finds, especially in Gettysburg and other places, and there's several books of these archaeological finds, and they're all almost little trinkets that they made, even like little dolls and stuff, and they're sitting in camp just remind them of home, or little games of dice made from bone, antler. So foraging was tough for them towards the end. They didn't really have fruit, veg or anything. I think yeah. So it was interesting to learn about that, especially reading the letters home where people were starting to go into hunger or starvation, and they were eating whatever they could and try to share with their friends as well. And some letters they don't want to share with their friends at all because they still don't get on with several lads in their unit they might not like.
Yeah, tough out there.
Yeah,
Out there in the woods in the rain and the cold.
Yeah.
So you guys have both done work on the Irish involvement in the American Civil War, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. I'll start with you, Damian. If you could just tell us how many Irish-born men participated in the American Civil War, and what did that participation look like?
Yeah, so around about 200,000 Irish-born men fought in the war. The vast bulk of them for the US, for the North, about 180,000 Irish-born there. And on top of that, in the North, there's about 70,000 children of Irish immigrants. So you've about 250,000 men. So it's massive. It's the biggest war, actually, probably in the history of the landmass of like the Republic, but in an all-Ireland context, only the First World War kind of compares in terms of numbers. So like it's very, very significant. And obviously a lot of that's driven by the famine. And stuff, and you know, just to go back to the conflict archaeology element of this, one of the things I've been looking at is where you can trace people who fought back to like the housesteads and visit them in an Irish context, you know, these 19th century abandoned houses and stuff. Sometimes even when, you know, letters have come back from America there, which I think is an interesting kind of side of conflict archaeology, if you want to call it that. But yeah, so that's kind of the numbers. Probably somewhere in the region of 35,000 to the Irish-born guys get killed in that battle. Get killed in that war rather. And so that, you know, it's a major again traumatic event for a lot of people who had gone through the Irish famine, and something that impacts Ireland too. Like, you know, there's a lot of people who are still back in Ireland who are getting all these death notifications and things of what's happening in the war. But they certainly had a lot of challenges again. On the kind of archaeology / mass grave front, one of the most kind of poignant, I think, of finds from American Civil War archaeology is on a battlefield called Antietam in Maryland. It's the bloodiest single day in American history. And before one parcel of that land came into the National Park Service, it's illegal to metal detect on National Park Service land, but before it came in, these metal detectors found a bunch of human remains kind of jumbled together. But in amongst them, they found things like buttons that identify these guys as members of a famous Irish brigade. And these guys, in fact, one of them, they were able to tell from the bones because he was in his 40s, they've been able to narrow him down to one of 3 people. But these guys were carrying religious, like crucifixes, rosary beads and things on them. And of course, in America, you know, the Irish are predominantly Catholic, but most of the United States is not, and there's a lot of anti-Irish immigrant sentiment because they're immigrants and they are Catholic, and so they don't have a lot of chaplains and things. And so one of the things the Irish are actually doing, because they don't have often a lot of access to chaplains, although the guys in the Irish Brigade did, but they're carrying these kind of religious Catholic objects with them to try and get protection and things on the field to try and help them get through it. And, you know, that's a direct archaeological link to the Irish service in the war. There's also, you know, on the camp life thing, just interesting Irish elements to it. There was a camp excavated in Arkansas where they found a load of clay pipes, and a lot of the clay pipes were actually, you know, the nice mid-19th century clay pipes that you can get with like Irish symbolism on them and everything. And so these lads were all there smoking their Irish pipes from Ireland with like little harps and shamrocks on them and stuff like that. So kind of bringing a bit of Ireland with them. But yeah, it's an enormously rich experience that doesn't... I'm always talking about this. I mean, it's quite scandalous the degree of attention it gets in Ireland, because
I agree in that.
The records that have been left behind from that war tell us more about 19th century Irish women than anything we have in Ireland. More about Irish men. They're just enormous, and we've only begun to kind of scrape the surface of what potential they have.
Yeah, if you could talk a bit about speaking of the Irish women. I know your work focuses on the pension files. Could you talk a bit about how that increases our understanding?
Yeah, that's the next 3 hours gone now. You should never have asked me that question. Yeah, well, they're in my view, they're the richest resource that tell us about ordinary 19th century Irish people that exists anywhere. The Americans quickly developed. The British were quite slow to develop like a proper pension system for ordinary enlisted men through much of the 19th century. So obviously we have lots of guys fighting in the Crimea, fighting in, say, the Peninsula War and everything. Like enormous numbers of Irish are joining the military, primarily economic reasons, serving throughout the empire. But the British don't really bring in a proper pension system for its ordinary enlisted men until kind of the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. The Americans, though, brought it in the war in 1862, and they brought in a system that would pay men if they got disabled, because if you're a labourer and you lose your arm, you know, you're ruined. So they brought it in for that, and they brought it in for wives and for mothers of servicemen who had been reliant on the income that the man brought in. And part of it was to try and encourage recruitment. We look after you and yours if something happens to you. But these files, there's like tens of thousands of these files relating to Irish people sitting in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., just down from the White House. And some of them run to hundreds of pages. You have letters written by soldiers, generally to mothers and wives. You have statements, often very long statements from illiterate Irish women explaining their entire lives in Ireland, in America, how many children they've lost, where they married, how they married, where in Ireland they married, following decades of their lives. And these payments were given out on a quarterly basis. Hundreds of them were being paid out in Ireland to people who had never left Ireland, being paid out by the US government. And it's just this phenomenal social record of these people's existences. You know, I was reading one recently in relation to an Irish woman who lost her son, and she goes through when she was married. Her husband worked on the railroads. He drank himself into oblivion. He was running around with other women. She was trying to support the family as much as she could through washer work and things. Irish police are being, and this is in America, Irish police being called to the house because of the quarreling that's going on between them. She loses her son, and then her husband gets run over on the railroad, probably because he'd been drinking. But you just see she is recounting the hardship of her life, and she's illiterate, but it's in the first person because of the way she's telling the story. Just unbelievably rich source material into people. You know, because of the Irish Civil War, we don't even have census records for a lot of these people. You know, our first complete census in Ireland is 1901 that we have surviving. And so outside of them, women kind of interacting with like institutions or, you know, prison systems or something, we've been left with so little record of the poorest Irish working class, but this is an access point. And so it shows you how conflict can, when you look at it, can kind of open up these other windows, because ostensibly this is a war. These are war records, but really they're nothing to do with war at all, apart from the fact that somebody was lost in one. It's what it's creating afterwards.
Yeah, it tells us so much about society. That's so interesting. You wouldn't expect that from a wartime resource. And Alex, I know you did a lot of work on the letters that the soldiers sent home. Is there anything that really stood out to you or really impressed you about that correspondence?
What impressed me really was their motivation to stay positive. That was one thing they always write home about, and there weren't good times for them. They miss home, they miss their family, and that's one thing that comes across is how they miss being back home. And I suppose they left in hard times, and they probably had been in America for a while. They probably did have some sort of stable life for a while before the war. We said like recessions probably hit just about the start of the war, and they had to go find work. And I suppose the army offered good money, good pay, good times. So I suppose that sense of adventure maybe from, and then it just went off, but it wasn't what they expected. There was a lot of marching. A lot of people think American Civil War was a lot of fighting, but the marching was probably just as bad as them as the battles were.
They killed some of them, the marching.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And especially I've done a lot of looking at the southern states, and they did not have the gear equipment and that the north would have had. And a lot of these people were records of swapping shoes, because some person marched and one person wouldn't have shoes, so I'll take these first few miles and I'll give you my pair of shoes, I'll go barefoot, and they'll swap over. So it was harsh, but they'd always try to stay positive, really, because they can't looking forward to things. And one guy would always sing a song or play a musical instrument or tell stories or just keep positivity going in camp. I suppose it's a campaign lifestyle for him, really. But this one you have to really stand out and impress me. I suppose our Irish positivity about everything.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much. That comes to the end of our episode. That's been so interesting. Thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us about your expertise. And before I let you go, I have a surprise for you. Here at Rubicon, we have patented the very first time machine, and we would like to give you free access to anywhere you would like to go, forward or backward in time. We'll also provide you with a translator. It doesn't have to be anything that we talked about on this episode. It can be anywhere that you want to go, but you only have 1 hour because the time machine is very energy intensive to run. So where would you like to go?
Alex.
Hedeby. I think I'd love to see Hedeby, what it would look like back in the day. Just because I think at the moment Hedeby is a Viking village, but I think I'd love to see what it would look like in the day. But I think more importantly, I would love to see what Cork would have looked like back in Viking age Cork.
Yeah,
be
that's
the
very
Cork then
interesting.
as well. I'd love to be able to see what it was like and just what the streets were and just be able to walk through maybe medieval Cork and just see what it really looked like.
Damien, where are you going?
Well, I suppose people probably expect me to say something from the Civil War, but I probably would say if I had an hour, I would probably go back to my first love is the wrong word, but probably to Kinsale to look at because half an hour would probably do actually to see what exactly occurs on the day of the engagement there when the Irish are moving up and then get kind of, it's not even a battle really, they just get wiped off the field really quickly, and it's such an important moment in Irish history it has such enormous consequences if they had been victorious there versus what happened, which was defeat, and within about 30 minutes it all falls apart. But to kind of understand a bit more, because lots of us who look at it have different theories in relation to what occurred. But yeah, I wouldn't mind getting to the bottom of the Kinsale mystery, because a lot of the battlefield almost certainly is unfortunately gone under a pharmaceutical plant. So we probably will never be able to tell from archaeology what exactly occurred there. But yeah, that would be where I would go.
Fascinating answers. Well, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a million, Gretchen.
Yeah, I'll catch you the next time.
So there we have it, folks. An interview with Alex Lee and Damian Shiels. Gretchen, how do you think it went?
That's fantastic. They're so interesting. I could listen to them talk for hours.
I always find that this is not a subject that, as I say, I don't know a whole lot about. But listening to people who are passionate about their subject, I will listen to them speak all day.
Whatever they have to talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating.
I loved the reaction from Damian in that episode of when Alex started talking about the salted pork, was it, that he did in college?
Oh, yeah.
For conflict archaeology. The disgust on Damian's face.
Yeah.
You can feel it. It's really good to, as you said at the intro, to see an academic talking to somebody who's living it and using that experimental archaeology kind of side of things.
I think experimental archaeology is so interesting.
Yeah, it is.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to get into that world more and learn more about it. Yeah.
What kind of experiments would you like to do?
Oh, goodness. Weaving. I'd love to do some weaving. I'd love to recreate. I read this book by this textile archaeologist, and she was talking about how there was some fabric that they had found, and they set it up on the loom, and they realized it was such a strange pattern. It wasn't like normally you would go, over, under, and you'd repeat that. And then eventually she realized that it's because she had set it up backwards.
Oh.
And only by setting it up and trying to actually make it did she realize how these people created these garments, and it was opposite from how from how she thought it was going to be. Stuff like that. It's just
That's amazing, because that shows that until you actually physically go and do it.
Exactly. Yeah. You can speculate about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
All day long, but once you actually do it, then you feel how it would have been done.
So yeah, maybe we should get some more some more people on to talk about that.
Yeah.
If you're somebody
anyone out there, anyone who does experimental archaeology in any field, in any subject, let us know.
Or if you're somebody who has a good story or knows somebody who has a good story, get in touch with us. Maybe drop us a comment. Maybe send this podcast to somebody who you think would enjoy it, and follow us on social media. Just search Rubicon Archaeology on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, any of those places, and you can see some of the cool videos that Gretchen's been putting up from site.
That's right.
You've been on site in Waterford recently. How was it like to make that video?
It was great. We've had wonderful weather. We've had terrible weather. It's been a whole range.
It's Ireland, is what you're saying.
It's Ireland, yeah.
Was it 4 seasons in one day, they say?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. That's very accurate, yeah.
Make sure to stay tuned to the Shindig. If this is your first time listening to us, go back into our back catalogue. There's plenty of great interviews that you can enjoy. And also stay tuned. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can have us come into your ears every week for this season.
Into your ears, into your hearts, into your minds.
Exactly. Thanks so much for watching or listening. My name is Luke Barry.
And I'm Gretchen.
And this has been The Shindig.